Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Shay Mann and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and submit those in the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen, and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded, and we will email you a link to the recorded version tomorrow. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers that we have today. First up, we have Joe Carson, Chief Security Scientist at Thycotic. Joe is a cybersecurity professional and ethical hacker with more than 25 years experience in enterprise security, specializing in blockchain, endpoint security, network security, application security and virtualization, access controls, and privileged account management. Joe is a certified information systems security professional and an active member of the cybersecurity community. He is a cybersecurity advisor to several governments, critical infrastructure, financial, transportation, and maritime industries. Joe's regularly sharing his knowledge and experience, giving workshops on vulnerability assessments, patch management best practices, the evolving cybersecurity perimeter, and the EU General Data Protection Regulation. Our next speaker, Joe Gottlieb, Senior Vice President of Corporate Development here at SailPoint. As Senior Vice President of Corporate Development, Joe directs SailPoint acquisitions and technology alliances based on the company's growth objectives. Joe has spent the bulk of his career in the field of enterprise security. At Nokia, he held leadership positions in business development and product management, ultimately becoming the general manager of the industry's first security appliance business. At McAfee, he led corporate strategy and created the Security Innovation Alliance ecosystem. Joe left McAfee to run marketing and business development at SimSage, a leader in scalable log management and security analytics. He later became CEO, raised additional venture capital, and sold the company to KEYW, a cyber systems integrator focused on the intelligence community. So there's a little background for you on our speakers today, and with that, I would like to pass it over to Joe Gottlieb to kick us off.
Thanks, Shay, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm going to do a quick coverage of the agenda, but before I start, I just want to set the tone for this particular topic. This area of identity and access management and privileged account management is very, very active in the industry today. I've been doing technology alliances for almost 20 years now, and I've never seen a combination of technologies so forcefully thrust together by the requirements of large enterprises that are trying to make progress in each of these areas. And so it's with particular interest that we talk about this particular topic, how these things are coming together, why it's so important, and how you can be successful. So that'll be the goal of today's talk, and we look forward to sharing these thoughts with you. By way of agenda, as you can see, we've got a pair of Joes presenting the content, so hopefully we'll keep track of the names and the assignments. But Joe Carson will start us out talking a bit about the security landscape and dive into a real definition of how privileged accounts work and how you can protect them with privileged account management. I'll then pick up and talk about the differences between privileged account management and identity and access management and how these two technologies are being combined to drive a joint value proposition and reduce risks of breaches for enterprises. We'll then trade off sharing our views on best practices as they are being deployed today, as well as what's emerging and possible in the future, and of course then we'll open it up for Q&A. So with that, let's jump right into it. I'd like to turn it over to Joe Carson to give us a little bit of a tour of the security landscape that's setting up the need for these two technologies coming together.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to this exciting topic of session today. And one thing I kind of want to just kind of do a recap on, just to make sure that everyone is, I'm pretty sure everyone is aware of this, with the recent WannaCry and WannaDecrypt their ransomware that's been, circumventing and going around the world this past week. And we just want to kind of just really highlight and just bring back some good, best practices and tips. This is quite significant. It's really where ransomware has been somewhat conjoined with a worm, something similar to that of like Configure, that really caused major havoc, in the past. And this is something that is significant and very damaging And in some ways, it's, unless you have a really good data backup, there's some ways there's no recovery. Pretty much you have three options when you are faced with this screen: is you either restore from a backup, you pay the ransom, or ultimately you actually have to go and recreate the data again. And this is ultimately what many companies are facing right now. So with this, some of the things I'd like to share is, the top tips to stop ransomware, from, having to go through those ultimately three options. And we really are facing with, ultimately, education and cyber hygiene is definitely one of those areas. Making sure people are aware how to spot things like phishing or malicious email scams that ultimately are leading people to click on these types of malicious files. So it's really important that education and cyber hygiene. And I cannot stress more, backup, and make sure the backup is tested or works. And this is absolutely the way to come back in recovery. Least privilege is another great approach at preventing ransomware. This is really where you're actually making a user having standard privileges and not elevated like a power user or administrator. Least privilege means that any type of time that they click on something malicious and that malicious software requires a little bit of privileges, they're going to see that user access control. They're going to be prompted for additional rights. And this really stops ransomware in its tracks. It stops it from getting the elevation in order to encrypt or damage the system. Privilege account management is also a great way to make sure that these types of malicious software do not laterally move across the network like that of WannaCry. So privilege account management, and this is an area that we're going to really dive into in more detail. Application control is also a really great way at preventing these applications or malware from spreading. Application control is really, there's multiple flavors of it. There's, of course, the blacklisting, which is typically that of what antivirus and anti-malware does. But also whitelisting is another great approach, that being able to look at what is trusted sources and trusted applications before allowing them to get those privileges to do more activities in the systems. And then again, with the recent WannaCry patching and security updates are essential today to making sure that you have deployed those. Of course, sometimes you have to look at where situations like where legacy systems, which WannaCry did impact for the likes of XP and so forth, but making sure that those are more locked down and not as facing to other systems that makes them more compromised. So these are just some good tips to get you, allow you to leave you and make sure that you are either doing one, if not more, of these in your environment to really prevent you from getting impacted from the likes of WannaCry, which has been causing major havoc. So moving on just a little bit more, I'm not going to go into each of these in detail. I just want to highlight probably two here, but it's probably some of the most indicating and most alarming statistics. The first one is that 81% of breaches involve weak or stolen credentials in this past year. And this is up from 63% on the previous year. So this is really showing that weak and stolen credentials is actually one of the main areas of compromise. It has the human element and it also has the system element, that making sure that your credentials are not weak and that when they are stolen, that you have multiple ways to remediate or prevent them from being exploited or used and abused. Another major statistic is the 3 billion records and credentials that were stolen in 2016. This almost represents 1 in every person using the internet. That is quite alarming, that if you have in a single year almost every single person being exploited or being part of a cyber crime, this is something that we need to look at how to remediate and how to reduce the threat of having those records exposed. So these are just some of the areas that, just to recap, that some of the areas that we've seen in 2016 that have significant implications. I think one of the areas that we commonly see, and I sat through many sessions today, I've been at different conferences this past week, and we always see about, locking down the perimeter, locking down the defenses, ensuring that bad actors or external hackers are unable to get access to systems and cause damage, like that we've seen with the recent ransomware. However, one thing we have to remember is that people inside the network who have those trusted access, who have credentials in order to go and change and modify systems, and those users who have actually authenticated and approved access. In this particular case, it shows the damage that can be done. This one had a system administrator who was let go from the company And ultimately, that person, when he was let go, still maintained VPN access to the environment. Access was still available and still accessible, after that person had already left the company, and was able to come back in, and from that access caused $1 million in damage to the company. Of course, going through and that person, of course, being prosecuted and sentenced and doing time, it has a good indication that at least the legal side of things and the law enforcement is working. However, I'm pretty sure that this company would have wanted to prevent the damage from occurring in the first place. One is making sure that you're not in a post-incident scenario where financial has major costs, and also having to go through those legal issues with the damaging impacts that maybe their customers or third parties would have experienced. So this is also significant, is that making sure that those who inside access or who may even get access sprawl do not maintain access that they should no longer have. So one thing I want to highlight is that my background is being ethical hacking and doing a lot of passive assessments. And I want to bring up the point is that when you think about hackers, sometimes you have this kind of thought of Mr. Robots, or you have these media interpretations of what really hackers are looking at. And of course, over the years, we've seen it focused and targeted all its strength in things like financial fraud or financial activities, and also from a nation-state perspective. But I want to bring it down to the real thing that hackers are actually going after, what the real motivation that their activities are exploiting. And this is really about personal information. If we talk about why we've seen stolen credentials being exploited in 2016, if you want to talk about the 3 billion credentials and identities that have been stolen in 2016, it's because it is the prime target by cyber criminals. The reason why is that the more personal identifiable information those hackers can obtain means that ultimately they can actually use those identities to create authentic and real digital footprints, real digital identities that allow them to be abused and sometimes can be used for financial crime, and can sometimes be used for gaining access, or sometimes from being used to exploit more access to other identities by befriending using compromised accounts. So this is the real core information that is being sought after and being used to exploit and being able to use to compromise organizations at many levels. So it's important that these are classified and where possible to make sure that we mitigate and reduce the risks of each of those pieces of information, as well as going through classification. And it's also been the main target of regulatory compliance as well. You may have seen things like these being highlighted in different privacy laws, as well as in the European General Data Protection Regulation in recent months. And ultimately, the main reason to steal those identities and to be able to use that information is to really obtain the access, is to exploit and get that user to hand over the password, to give it to you. The easiest way to exploit a password and to get a password is for that individual to provide it, is to actually type it in and pass it over to you. And this is what most of the exploits are doing. We've seen recently the phishing scams that has occurred within Google Docs, which is basically that's providing an image of a document to be downloaded, and in fact it's actually a hyperlink that takes you to a login page, ultimately to extract and steal the passwords. And then of course they validate whether that access is real, is verified, and is working in order to really pull the information back, analyze it, correlate it in order to do further damage. So ultimately at the core, and in many situations, password is really the difference between that of a basically simple perimeter breach and potential major catastrophe. So we go through the scenario about what has taken the course of action, how did we get here? And I can tell you, I've been in the industry for 25 years, and I've been a person that's been really focusing historically on the traditional perimeter. There was always that element that you had something to protect. You had a fortress, you had a castle walls, you had something that was inside, whether it being a bank. You had to put perimeters, you had to put defenses, and to make sure that no one who was unauthorized got into that access area. And this ultimately had several flaws, is that you had to make sure you're only looking at the perimeter, and you had to make sure that that perimeter was 100% functional and working. If the perimeter was ever breached, You had no way of determining when somebody had internal access. And of course, cloud, Internet of Things, mobility, connectivity has all made that perimeter very blurred, meaning that almost every single one of your employees is now a walking internet connectivity. They're a walking hotspot. And when they walk into the office walls, they can simply have that data flowing in and out through their mobile phone rather than the internet or telco that you may have been used. So ultimately we get into the discussion over years was add layers and layers, more perimeter controls, more security layers, segmentation of duties, segmentation of network. So you basically put in your defenses, you've got multiple layers, ultimately to prevent bad people from getting in and also the internal people from leaking data out. And we've had different methods of doing that. But again, when we go back into really looking at what has been happening in the industry, is that simply by me stealing the credentials of a trusted insider, I can simply put on the uniform or make it look like I'm that trusted person and bypass all the security controls, ultimately making most of those technologies, almost defenseless in really determining the difference. And of course, we've seen a lot of uptake in things like machine learning and artificial intelligence and behavior to do this. But ultimately, you really need to be looking at the right behaviors and the right analysis. So this leads to really that next perimeter, the next area. And we have to take this in a multi-layered approach. We have to really look at it in each component individually. And this is really a highlight, how privileged account management is actually functioning and the criticality of making sure that we actually look at each areas in how they function and work together. So ultimately, the first thing is, of course, to make sure you have a way to actually identify, a way to track and understand whether, of course, this being a human or even a system, that actually being able to associate that digital identity to a person or system. This is crucial, so being able to really identify it back. And of course, I go with a model of a zero trust model. My model is basically make sure that trust is gained. It's basically established. It's never just given. So ultimately in this way that we have some way of what I refer to as this trust level, to establish a trust level, to make sure we can tie that digital identity into our systems. So providing things like multi-factor authentication and different ways to determine a trust level or a state of accepted risk. And then making sure that you put all of those privileged accounts, those access that has sensitive access to whether it being data, systems, sensitive areas of the network, whether access to applications, you have to make sure that those are actually protected and secured within a vault that has either additional levels of security and controls applied to them. This is crucial to make sure that you actually put layers of, not in your perimeter, but layers in the access controls and the sensitivity of those systems, and then therefore identifying classifications. And of course, making sure data is securely put away and placed in secure vaults as well. In this case, we have the ability to then check reputation, checking reputation of this trusted person and making sure that the reputation is maintained at a certain level of trust, and then checking changes in behavior. Once you create basically a understanding of that metadata, that footprint, that continuous access, you can build up the behavior, and when it kind of moves away, that you can then establish whether you need to reestablish the trust level again, to re-engage with that person to make sure that they really are authentic and are who they initially were to be. Ultimately preventing the attacker from really stealing or really compromising those accounts. And even if they did, it's limited, and also with that trust level and that ability to do dynamic security means that you can really prevent that from being laterally moved or compromised even further. So one of the things I want to kind of bring it down to, what is a privileged account? Where many organizations, sometimes it's quite interesting when I ask this particular question to organizations, even governments, what is a privileged account? They sometimes in the mindset, they think of people, they think of the administrators, they think of help desk, and ultimately they kind of come back with the numbers of individuals who are managing or maintaining systems. But actually, the in fact truth is that privileged accounts are everywhere. Every time you get a new application, it may come with a service account. It may come with an application that needs to do certain levels of privileges. It may be IoT devices, whether it being Wi-Fi access points, even your home TV, your connected vehicle. All of these come with some level of permissions that allow you to make configurations to change the security ultimately, or add or change the security levels of users. And they can be also non-human or human accounts. There can be either or. They're located everywhere on the network, on-premise, in the cloud, hardware, applications, and in network devices as well. And it's crucial here is that they actually represent one of the most vulnerable aspects of an organization. If your domain administrator is ever compromised, ultimately it means that the response, or the appropriate response to actually kind of reduce that risk, is that you actually really need to rebuild Active Directory again. And that's a scary thought for many organizations. That is something that, to really get back to compliance, meaning that you have to make sure that that access level did not actually do any, backdoors or create users or manipulate data that would actually create compromising. And it's quite interesting that this is something that many organizations are not prepared for, and their incident response plans do not cater for this. And ultimately, it comes down to is the difference between that of a simple perimeter breach or simple data breach to that of what could potentially be a cyber catastrophe. So protecting, this is kind of to explain more about what privileged account management really entails. It's not something that is simplicity. It's not something that is simply just managing a password. It has many different complexities and many different components that really make it work and function. So ultimately, we kind of look at this, and you can look at it from different things in your organization, from applications to the servers and the operating systems to databases, network devices, even security technologies, whether it be firewalls or SIEMs and so forth. And even your IoT devices, and look like things like SCADA controls, or you look at PLCs, and you look at other IC industrial control systems, and even health systems as well. So ultimately, when you get across that in your network, and you think about the complexity of having to go into each of the systems and manage the credentials and accounts, and also add auditing and add controls and add session recording on top of those, is something that is quite complex in nature. But we do try to make it simple for those who need to interoperate and use those capabilities. So only by having a vault allows you to really provide the access to administrators, so not giving the administrators unfederated access. They actually have controls and have basically in regards to ensuring that they check out and leverage those access when required. And ultimately authenticating with things like Active Directory as an authenticator method. And then also for those external users or even third parties that need to access your systems and applications and data, they can also provide additional controls over those as well to make sure that you may have differences between those of administrators and those who are actually external users or even users of the system, that they may have much more granular controls or differences in how you either do the auditing or workflows to give them access. And then providing the controls of managing those passwords, managing the security, the retirement, the life cycle, the session recording. So when actually this external user who may be accessing it from a different country, a different location, you may want to actually record the session and the control that they have. So later you can replay it back and look at the contextual awareness of that. So ultimately providing much more auditing capability, and then allowing you to continually monitor the activity to make sure that it's not being abused, you're staying within those regulatory needs, and making sure that you can actually enforce the policies that your company set against each of those controls. And we also have a great way of actually allowing this into the ecosystem. We have a very robust and very flexible and easy to use API that really what we see is actually is the initiation what we refer to as our privilege ready program, that is really providing privileges as a service so that you can actually ultimately gain and make sure that more PAM or privilege account management is across the organization, that it really makes it simplified and easy. Ultimately preventing the attacker from compromising and limiting the ability to actually expose those credentials that may have been leaked on the internet. And this is why we can really get the enforcement is that those digital identities were really about the governance and the identity and access management, and combining it with privilege account management together is actually one of the most strongest differentiators that organizations can go for today. It really actually is an enabler also for many other technologies or directions that organizations. It also makes it much easier to actually do adoption of new technologies as well by having a very strong identity access management governance, and privileged account management. At that point, I'm going to pass over to Joe to really explain about why these combinations add much higher value.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to start on this slide over on the right side, since Joe just took us through the intricacies of how privileged account management systems help you to protect the sensitive accounts, the system accounts, the admin accounts, the root accounts, those things that have such great access to our resources that we're protecting. I'll start over on that side, and then I'll bring in on the left side the things that identity and access management can do. So you see on the right side there, Joe touched on some of these topics, right? Locking down those credentials in a vault, being able to control who has access to those accounts that the vault is now administering, being able to control the session, i.e. being able to end the session if an observed behavior is inappropriate, falls outside the policy. Also then continuous monitoring, video recording of the session, not only for, in some cases, some real-time monitoring and capability to actually respond, but also ultimately to log that video session so that you can go back and do searches and figure out what happened if you're trying to troubleshoot or dig into forensics on a particular breach. So we refer to these as deep controls for privileged accounts. Think of it as going to greater lengths, going to greater trouble to make the most precious accounts harder to use and only usable with a higher cost, let's say, in air quotes, of protection, right? You don't want to impose these controls on all accounts. That's not typically necessary. But for the most precious accounts, you've got to be able to be advancing your deepest and most powerful controls to make sure that they're being used appropriately. If you flip over to the left side of this chart, we're looking more at broad governance across all accounts, right? And so really what a SailPoint identity governance administration system does is it allows you to manage the vast complexity of not only the routine accounts or least privileged capabilities that you want to share with all users, but then also their specific capabilities and entitlements that are necessary for them to do their jobs, i.e. which special systems they log into, along with the privileged accounts that are being utilized not only by administrators, but also by professional workers or other workers that have access to the most sensitive systems. You must bring that all together and be able to discover all of it. You need to be able to provision it and deprovision it based upon the life cycle of your end users. So when a new user is hired, you provision them with the entitlements that they need to do their job. For some users, that might be just a least privilege capability, so they get access to productivity applications and the network and things like that. For other users, you might be provisioning very, very privileged accounts, and so you need to be able to do that. The example Joe cited, when that administrator was let go, fired from the paper factory, and yet still had VPN access that allowed him to cause all that damage. Why did that happen? Well, the reason it happened, and it continues to happen, is because many organizations still don't have automated provisioning and deprovisioning based upon things as simple as when employees are terminated, right? And the reason that you need automated policies and controls for these life cycle events is that it's just become too complex to manage by hand. Think of it. We can't remember things. We create these digital lists all the time. Imagine trying to remember, to be vigilant about changing the status of accounts on individual employees when they're coming into the organization, they're leaving, they're changing jobs, etc. So that ongoing process is something that, we make easier to manage and more importantly, easier to automate. And then you also have the typical governance types of use cases such as certifying access. So you ought to be able to go in and recertify access of each user on an ongoing basis based upon the frequency that fits the sensitivity of their access and perhaps your audit posture at any given time. You also want to be able to let users request things that they need access to that they maybe don't yet have access to, but they feel they need to do their job. And you need a workflow and approval policy so that can actually be handled according to some established rules, right? And so if you've got those systems in place, you're going to get clean and stay clean on who should have access to what, and you'll have much better audit, posture and confidence going into those audits. Now, also, you need to make sure that all of this is working across all of that diverse infrastructure and end devices and applications and data that we show at the bottom, right? It's not enough to do this on only some of your systems. In fact, there's always the last mile that you're constantly reaching for as new things change. New applications brought online, companies have a merger and they come together and two different systems have to be consolidated. All kinds of scenarios are driving an ongoing diversity and heterogeneity in these systems, but we have to stay on top of it. And so we need these types of solutions to help us get clean and stay clean and manage the accounts within. Now, if you advance to the next slide, Joe, we'll see how these two things can come together. You'll notice that there was some discovery and provisioning quite necessary in the privileged account management world. You've got to be able to discover who has the accounts to be able to start to manage them in a privileged account management context. But now bringing this together so that we can actually have one consolidated view of both basic accounts as well as privileged accounts in the governance system is critical. And then we also have the ability to make sure that these deep controls are actively applied within the context of policy and specific access, right, where appropriate. So then if we go to the next slide, let's start with some basic, use cases for how to get best practice rolling in here. So now here are the mechanics of what you have to get done between these systems. First of all, you have to be able to import all the privileged entitlements that are managed by the privileged account management system into SailPoint. That's what now allows SailPoint to have this complete view of who has access to what. If you're doing governance, right, and you only have a partial view, you only have partial governance. So when you look to establish an effective governance and effective ability to audit who has access to what, you've got to be able to import these privileged entitlements in to mix with all the other entitlements you already can see in your governance system. I mentioned certification. You now need to be able to certify the privileged entitlements within your certification campaigns, as we call them. So you tend to run campaigns that assess who has access to what and recertifies that access based upon supervisor approvals and or asset owner approvals. All of this is configurable and has to fit the policies that the enterprise chooses. But now with your certification campaigns, when you have these two systems working together, you can actually make sure that you're certifying both routine access as well as privileged access. When we talk about provisioning, I mentioned this. So all the lifecycle events that are being dealt with, for example, SailPoint is tied into the HR system when a new employee is hired or a new contractor is turned on or they change roles or they leave the company, all those lifecycle events have to drive the provisioning and deprovisioning of both routine and privileged accounts. And last but not least, we talked about access requests, right? So accessing, you want to be able to access, make that access in SailPoint. There's a nice catalog of access that you can browse through. You make your selections, you hit submit, and then those selections are then shipped off of the people that have to approve those things. And let's say if you request a toxic combination of access, the policy is going to tell you, well, you can't have both of these. You can't, you can't create vendors and pay vendors because that's an easy fraud scenario. So we're going to prevent that and cause you to choose one. Or in some circumstances, companies choose to allow that with a submitted reason. So in some cases, we waive the policy and we allow that to happen as long as it's being audited and tracked and there's a temporary condition that's established. So those are the basic mechanics of how these systems need to come together to support the ongoing governance processes that I've been talking about. So we move on to the next slide, Joe. Let's talk about how this actually shows up in IdentityIQ. So with that, why don't you take it away?
Sure, absolutely. So basically what we're seeing here is we're seeing a numerous screenshots that we have. The one that's probably to start off with is the one up in the right-hand corner. This is really where we've got what's known as an application for secret server within IdentityIQ. And it allows you to really set up and configure how and what is pulled and how to actually define also the policies as well from secret server. Solely this is where we actually making the combination, the connection between the two. And once that's set up, once you've got the application configured to actually integrate into secret server, the next thing then we end up having is on the left-hand side here where we end up pulling all of those secrets and entitlements into IdentityIQ. So this gives you a single view pane of all of the secrets that actually is then pulled and actually brought into IdentityIQ in the entitlement catalog. What you can then do is drill down further into the secrets, and you can start seeing exactly what additional properties each of the secret has. So, for example, as we mentioned, that a secret may have, for example, session recording enabled. It may have forcing additional factor of authentication. It may have a workflow. It may have different types of auditing capabilities. So this is really where you start to see not only do you have secrets and what who has access and what they're entitlement to, but also what additional security controls we've applied to those secrets themselves. And then also who's been delegated, who may have additional sharing of the secrets as well. And then down on the right-hand side is really who's the members of those secrets. So this is really where you have that single view pane and bringing all of those important information together about who has what access to privileged accounts, what those privileged account security controls have applied to them, what additional enforcement, what auditing capabilities, and also who has access to those. And bringing those in and actually bringing them together with what Joe had mentioned around the provisioning, around the actual entitlement, around the request and access information, really providing that additional value, allowing that full end-to-end governance of those accounts, and also making sure that you have a single pane of view into the security controls as well.
So now that you've seen how these entitlements flow in from Secret Server managed by Thycotic and into IdentityIQ, the SailPoint product, right? You now can have this data being part of the policy constructs that are constantly being imposed, right? So these first-class objects can now be part of policies that are triggered. So as I mentioned, you could start to trigger toxic combinations of very, very sensitive access. You may not want to have, for example, sensitive application access and sensitive database access held by a single administrator, because they can really start to, exert a lot of leverage across the infrastructure via those layers and actually compromise, database access indirect, whereas there might be some controls that are inside the application. So they could get access and hide their tracks via combinations like that. So if we go to the next slide, I want to just paint a picture of how all of this really can come together and provide this complete comprehensive access visibility. So imagine your users, are there on the bottom. I like to think about what we do in identity governance is we serialize every user. So every user has a unique ID, and we are now able to see all of their privileges for that individual user. So we can manage that user, right? We can manage their access on an individual basis. We can look at what groups they're in, and so that we can manage those groups. But as you can see here, between roles and entitlements and passwords, they've wound up with a variety of privileges, right? You've got some standard business role accounts that they might have. They all seem to have those. You notice here that I've got some named privileged accounts that may have come with very specific roles that they have within their job, right, to do their job. And then here you see user, quadruple 03 or whatever, has some shared privileged accounts. So here's, these are system accounts, right, where they don't tend to have names, but now for the first time I can see them associated with a specific user. And where normally that is abstracted from the actual identity, right? Yes, we know how to, we know which users are in those groups, but then they have shared access to this particular highly sensitive control. Now we can see on an individual user basis who has those shared accounts along with other privileges that they might have gotten from other means, other approvals. And so you can start to see the governance benefit accumulating by your ability to have this comprehensive view and then the ability to act on any combination or any threshold of risk that you might see in your environment. So
Joe, just
go ahead.
Just in addition, just want to comment on that, the shared privilege accounts as well. What's also crucial is that, as you said, you may have access to shared accounts. And one of the great things about pulling those, those secrets into IdentityIQ is that we may have actually reduced their security ability to disclose the password or to change the account on the system. So with those shared accounts, they may actually have reduced access from a secret server perspective as well. So it's also great to be able to have that visibility, especially when we're talking about shared accounts.
Great point, because those properties would show up and allow you to, when you drill down on the user, you might be checking up on this actual access and determine, wow, I'm glad that I see the extra controls there and maybe some limitations, and maybe that obviates the need for an additional policy because those controls are in place. Or it might shape how the policy is built and applied because you've got those safeguards that are being applied by Secret Server. Great addition. So, if we look more towards the future, and actually this is not a future, this is doable today, but it's being increasingly adopted by our customer base. We talk a lot about how, a risk calculus can really help us to feed good automated policies. And what I'm showing here is a little bit of a simplistic example, but what IdentityIQ helps you to do is it helps you to take all of the accounts that each user has. Think back to that vertical view of all the accounts that have been accumulated into what we call the identity cube for that user. And you can now, you can configure which accounts are the most sensitive, and then of course you can configure the depth of privilege as another dimension of sensitivity. And now you can look at all of that access that a user has, and based upon a single risk score in SailPoint IdentityIQ, you can now start to separate your population into different communities. You've got the green folks here that are very, very, have a low-risk profile because they don't have a lot of sensitive access and they don't hold a lot of accounts. Obviously, the yellows are in that medium zone and the reds are in that red, that very, very high-risk profile zone. And one thing that we see customers do is that they actually change the frequency of recertification for these different user populations because they have different risk profiles, right? So the high-risk profile, they might be on a quarterly or an even monthly or sometimes continuous recertification of access, right? There are extreme cases here where you may want to be going to a continuous certification. So any new business event that alters the context for how you might use an entitlement might require recertification by people that are in place to approve that. That's the extreme case, but even a monthly recertification can be a very, very strong control for this high-risk group. And of course, you want to relax the way that you handle the folks that have a very, very low risk. You want to reduce the impacts or the impediments that are occurring on their job because they don't have the kinds of access that can really do the damage that you're worried about. And that's where Joe mentioned earlier least privilege. When you've got good least privilege controls, you can truly have a green zone where you put down very, very smart and effective safeguards, and you need to worry a lot less. You need to be constantly vigilant, of course, and observe behavior and see if things change. But you can move forward confidently and aggressively knowing that you've got strong safeguards in the green group. So if we move along here, Joe, I think you've got another view on this as well. So talk to us about privileged behavior analysis.
Absolutely. So this is a recent addition to Thycotic, which we introduced in April. And this is really where we now have the ability to actually really make the actual privilege use and what's happening within the privileges within the Secret Server. We're really able to provide a much more behavior, a much more top level into really to make it what's important, what you need to see, what's the important vital components and uses within those secrets within Secret Server. And this is where we have that analysis. We can start really bubbling up the most vital information that you need to take action, whether it being, to your point, whether you need to recertify or revalidate the need for having those privileges, should they still exist, if they haven't been used in 6 months. And ultimately also the ability to see when they're being used at certain times. You may be interested to see those privileges that's used on the weekends, or those that's out of hours, those that may be having multiple hops. Somebody's going from one system to another and to another. So therefore you can see privilege association or privilege mapping as well. So this is really a vital part to really determine which privilege accounts are actually keeping your business somewhat going in operations, which are the ones that actually people use to do their job, and those ones that may not be used that often. So it's really allowing you to see that transparency. Now, what's important here is not only do we have that clear visibility and bringing it up to the top to give you that analysis, but we're also introducing what we call as dynamic security, is really the ability to say that, well, okay, we now establish a certain level of a baseline, that we now understand that these privileged accounts, this is their normal active use and behavior. and we can start a risk score to say that whenever that privilege account actually goes below a certain threshold or is a certain risk level, therefore we can take certain types of actions. And right now we have some actions that were in place, but we're actually going to further advance and elaborate on those much more in the future. But some of the things is, for example, you may be connected via a certain IP address. And you may, of course, that may be a VPN connection. You may be using from a certain browser, or you may be doing a certain access from system A to system B. And if all of a sudden that behavior, that analysis, that changes, or you may all of a sudden be accessing outside of normal times that you would have done in the past, we can then force a reconnection. We can drop that connection, and then, or we can potentially trigger recording of that session to see what's happening during those unusual or abnormal behavior. So really understanding about, okay, something's unusual here. We need to reestablish that trust. We need to bring back that trust level to a certain level before we can allow it to continue. So this is really where we have that behavior analysis capability to really show you what privileges are important, how they're being used, and then ultimately allowing that dynamic trust level or dynamic security to really allow you to change the threshold and make sure that your access and the actual privileges and those controls are actually happening when you're in a safe mode or safe level, or you're confident in the trust level of those accounts.
So here we'd like to now zoom out on a broader ecosystem view and talk about how together SailPoint and Thycotic are delivering this identity perimeter security, but so importantly, working with a variety of other vendors that are out there that our enterprise customers are having to integrate and manage as portfolios. You know, it's said that $75 billion is spent per year on security, which is a vast number to contemplate. Many enterprises have more than 100, some more than 200 different security vendors in their environments that are part of an effort to try to thwart, attacks and reduce breach risks. So it's no wonder that interoperability of these technologies, making sure that they can work effectively together, is so important. And I know Joe has a great example of this that he's seen several times, and I'll give one as well. Joe, why don't you give yours?
Sure, absolutely. And to just reiterate, as Joe mentioned, a ecosystem and having a holistic working together ecosystem is highly important. So making sure all of these technologies are complementing each other and adding the value of the core competencies that are there. And one of the areas that Thycotic provides in regards to where we focus at our expertise and knowledge and privileges and use of those privileges and security controls is around some of the integrations we have with the likes of Tenable. So for example, Tenable has the ability to, of course, do that vulnerability scanning across your network to really show you where systems may be lacking or may have vulnerabilities. And for Tenable to really be successful in doing that, they do need to have privileges and have credentials that allows them to do those scans very successful. So what we are able to do in making sure, for example, so even sometimes you may have a third party coming in and doing that assessment. And the last thing you want to be doing is duplicating credentials or getting access to third parties or contract workers, access to systems which you just don't want them to have that knowledge, and or even having to go through changing them after the fact that you've already had the scan done. So ultimately what we have the ability to do is Tenable can simply point in to Thycotic's secret server access and then pull out the tokens when it's doing those scans. Ultimately making sure that the scans are much more successful, much more accurate, and ultimately getting a much more understanding, much more transparent vulnerability assessment by simply using what Tenable is great at doing, at scanning the network for those vulnerabilities, and what Thycotic's great at doing is making sure that those privilege counts and providing the access when it's permitted, when it's allowed, ultimately not providing that third-party person or third-party system even visibility where they'll never know the credentials, and also reducing the duplication across the environment.
Great example. And the one I like to speak to is really about security monitoring. So for those of you that have been close to the security world over the years, you've known that we've through SIM, Security Information and Event Management Systems, we've always been trying to better understand what's going on in the network, on the applications, and across the systems and infrastructure. And so we're correlating these events, or we're doing forensics on logs and the like. But One of the things that we've lacked in these systems is a true ability to understand the exact users that are involved in the events. We see account names flying by, we see IP addresses and MAC addresses. It's very hard to associate these events with very specific users and then to know what they have access to. So we're making that information available. All that data that we've been able to pull together and associate with individual users in that identity cube, we're making that available to security monitoring technologies so they can, A, when they see any attribute of a user, they can immediately know now what user is involved. B, they can understand what else that user has access to. And then C, they could potentially prioritize based upon either our risk index or the known access to a sensitive account or entitlement. They could prioritize alerts that are coming out of their security analytics. Moreover, they can now ask SailPoint or potentially Thycotic to make a change based upon an alert. So the era that we're starting to step into now is active response, right, from the security analytics or the behavioral analytics that we see in these systems to trigger a positive response. And so one response that we make available, for example, is the suspension of entitlement or the involvement of a supervisor to recertify access. Another very typical one that's touched on in another category on this slide is multi-factor authentication. In Joe's model, where there's zero trust, right, multi-factor authentication step-ups is how we constantly test the user to re-authenticate, re-certify who they are when we see conditions that merit that extra control, that extra due care. And so that's a couple of the ways that we're working with a variety of partners to advance the overall usefulness of what oftentimes is a very complex and diverse security portfolio being managed by the enterprise. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions. So Shay, perhaps you can moderate the questions that have come in, and we'll take some questions, and then we'll then close out the webinar.
Great, thank you, Joe. This is just a reminder, if you have a question, insert it into the Q&A panel and we'll answer as many as we can in our allotted time. So let's go ahead and jump in. Our first question is on SailPoint PAM capabilities. Where do they overlap with CyberArk PAM capabilities, and what extra does SailPoint offer?
Well, I think you'd find that, as I described, we don't have in particular any specific PAM capabilities today. We have the ability to manage the access and the certifications and the whole process. So think of us as the administration system that makes it easy to manage all that complexity in total, whereas a company like Thycotic has those deeper controls that we talked about, the credential vaulting, the session monitoring, the session control, and now adding the behavior visibility and analytics and triggers for things that are observed in the actual events. So we don't have those capabilities because that hasn't been our focus. But when you bring these two together, you can now get those horizontal policies from the governance applying across all users, all entitlements, all accounts that include, where appropriate, the deeper controls provided by Thycotic.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, next question. So is there no secret server specific connector? Is it just a JDBC? Many just govern as opposed to provisioning to Thycotic.
So I'll take first crack at that. So the way that you get these two systems to work together, right, I'll speak to the SailPoint side and Joe Carson can speak to the Thycotic side. On the SailPoint side, there's a simple module that you would download from Compass that allows you to enable IdentityIQ to recognize secret server. And Joe showed that in that upper right screen. That was the configuration screen for once you've installed this, it's called the STI module, the Simple Table Integration module, which is the bidirectional data flow mechanism that we've utilized to create this type of connector. So it's different than some of the connectors you may be familiar with in SailPoint, like the JDBC connector. It's similar to JDBC, and it employs a middle-tier database that we can both check to affect a bidirectional flow of data. So on the Thycotic side, Joe, do you want to comment?
Absolutely. That's exactly what we've done on the Thycotic side. We've actually made our data available to that middle tier, the STI database. And what we're also doing as well is this is a multi-phased approach as well. We're actually working on an additional level where we actually do a lot more actions as well. So based on things like where we can fill in discovery as well from SailPoint IdentityIQ, where we can actually then look at mapping those entitlements within the actual, for example, shared credentials and shared privileges, and also being able to then also set the policies based on the input. So one thing is that in the initial phase is to make sure we have that full transparency and governance and visibility into the security controls that we're doing. And the second phase is really for Secret Server to take action based on the inputs or direction from IdentityIQ as well. So we're continuing furthering what's available. So today it is that STI data sharing, and next we're looking to do much more actionable. And as well as one of the things I highlighted, the behavior portion as well, we'll be looking to also pull in the risk information as well from IdentityIQ to really overlay that with our risk score from the behavior analytics portion.
Excellent.
Great, thank you. Okay, that is all the time we have for questions now. In case we didn't answer your question, our expert teams will be following up with you early next week and take care of any unanswered questions.
So if we go to that final slide, I think we've got just some summary points to conclude with. Clearly, we've talked about how privileged accounts are essential to the management and administration of your infrastructure, but they also, because they offer great leverage to the attacker, we need to be able to apply those deeper controls. And if we do so within the context of an overarching identity and access management and identity and access governance approach like we've been talking about, you get this great combination. The deep controls for the privileged accounts, the complete visibility into all entitlements held by each user, and the horizontal policies and the way that you manage a sort of a get clean, stay clean approach to how entitlements need to change based upon the changes that you experience in your business. So those are the remarks that we had today. We really appreciate you joining us today. We will be sending you a link to this recording via email after the close of this session, and we're looking forward to working with you in your security efforts to reduce data breach risks through a combination of privileged account management and identity and access management. Thanks for joining us today, and have a great day.